Rebel News is filing a human rights complaint with the United Nations about the treatment of lockdown dissidents here in Canada. We're flying across the world to drop the complaint off in person, and we want you to get involved because we cannot do this without you. There is no correct or right religion, idea, or thought. Humans are free to seek fulfillment, whether in concert with their government's ideology or contrary to those ideologies. To do so, one's right to assemble with others, to exchange ideas, demonstrate unity, or seek information must be protected. These human rights, enshrined in Articles 18, 19, and 20 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, have been disregarded in Canada for those who do not share the opinions and beliefs of the government. The rule of law in Canada has now been weaponized to oppress dissidents. Now, those words are not mine, but I wish they were. They're the words of Sarah Miller from JSS Barristers based in Calgary. And she is the author of our human rights complaint to the United Nations that we are taking to Geneva this weekend. Our mission here at Rebel News is to tell the other side of the story, but it's so much more than that. We cannot, we must not sit by and do nothing if we can do something to fight, to help, to make a stand for freedom. Sarah and I are flying across the world this weekend to hand deliver a complaint to the United Nations about the state of civil liberties in this country. Because at Rebel News, we have firsthand knowledge of so much of the damage on the ground as rights of Canadians were being stomped on by governments. Now we need your help to make this trip, to support our emergency trip. Go to humanrightscomplaint.com. Before I get into the substance of the complaint, though, I want to tell you a little bit about Sarah Miller in case you don't know her, but if you are a regular viewer of Rebel News, especially these last 2 years, you do. She's a longtime, highly effective lawyer of Pastor Art Pawlowski, who secured a victory for him at the Alberta Court of Appeals, where she was able to have a panel of 3 judges overturn a finding of contempt against the pastor after he refused to allow health inspectors into his church to inspect it for COVID compliance, after the inspectors sought a secret court order to allow them to do so. Sarah is one of the most effective human rights lawyers in Canada. She fights for the little guy against the crushing resources of the state, and she wins. Now, we're flying cheap. We're taking the red eye. We're only staying on the ground in Geneva, Switzerland, 1 day, just long enough to deliver this complaint, and then I'm coming home. This is not a luxury vacation. It's a whirlwind trip to try to make the world take notice of what's happening here in Canada. But what else can we do? All the protections Canadians thought we had to shield us from government overreach and to protect our civil liberties at a time when they needed protecting the most have either failed us or were turned against us over these last 2 years in the name of public health. The courts, our healthcare, our jobs, sometimes our churches and our families, academia, the media, and our financial institutions. They let us down or they turned on us completely, becoming tools and enforcers of government overreach. Now, this isn't the first time we've done this sort of thing, taking a complaint to the United Nations when the civil liberties of Canadians are not protected by the government, which should protect them. We previously hired a leading civil rights scholar to file a human rights complaint on behalf of Michaels Spavor and Kovrig, who were held for years as political prisoners, hostages really, at the hands of the Chinese Communist government. You can see that previous complaint at freethetwomichaels.com. Now, our new complaint, which I'll attach to the text accompanying this video, is meticulously prepared by Sarah, but it's also plain language, so it's an easy 15-page read. Sarah cites some of the more egregious civil liberties violations at the hands of governments all across the country, but she doesn't cite them all, and how could she? There have been so many, and that's the point of all of this. Sarah cites the case of Brad Carrigan, who is charged with organizing the Calgary Freedom March. He faced a possible $100,000 fine and was subject to a 1.5 years of legal proceedings for protesting the restrictions on his civil liberties every single week. Sarah also details the case of Calgary pastor, the aforementioned Artur Pawlowski, whose case you can follow along at saveartur.com. He was initially charged with having illegal public gatherings when he did what he always does. He fed the homeless in downtown Calgary. Art's situation snowballed from there. He faced over 2 years of prosecution and legal proceedings against him, including several days of detention for not allowing his church services to be interrupted by public health officials who were coming to do an inspection. He faces charges of mischief and the only charge ever laid in the province of interfering with critical infrastructure for a sermon he gave to truckers protesting mandates at the Coates border crossing in Alberta. Sarah also lists the case of Pastor James Coates and Grace Life Church of Edmonton. Coates spent 35 days in jail. His church property was seized for approximately 90 days and the congregation forced to meet in secret after he refused to allow his church services to be inspected as they were in progress. He also didn't enforce COVID restrictions on his congregation. Included also is the case of Pastor Tim Stevens of Fairview Baptist Church in Calgary. His church services were repeatedly interrupted by the state, and he was arrested, held for weeks, taken away in front of his crying children by Calgary police for the crime of keeping his church doors open to parishioners seeking religious and spiritual guidance during the pandemic. Then we've got the case of Chris Scott, a small-town business owner from Mirror, Alberta, population 500 on a good day. He was arrested and held on an ex parte or secretly obtained court order that restricted his right to protest. The seizure of his property, including a gas station, a restaurant, a convenience store, and a campground, when he refused to close all of them to comply with the government's mandates. There's also the case of Pastor Tobias Tisson of the Church of God Restoration in Hanover, Manitoba. He's faced significant fines and constant police surveillance after he opened his church. Police even blocked the road to stop people from attending services and mass-ticketed congregants. When Tisson spoke at a protest in Winnipeg about what the government had done to his church, he was then charged with illegal gathering. Trinity Bible Chapel in Waterloo and Church of God Restoration in Aylmer, Ontario, have also been subject to extensive legal proceedings and enormous fines, again, simply for keeping their churches open to parishioners. Then there's Pastor Phil Hutchins from his Tabernacle Family Church in New Brunswick. He and his associate pastor faced arrest, and Phil faced incarceration for over a week for the same crimes as pastors before him, caring for their congregations when it became illegal during COVID. And of course, there's the case of Tamara Leach, the Medicine Hat, Alberta grandmother who spent 49 days in jail for peacefully protesting her government, charged with minor crimes of mischief, the crime of public inconvenience. But she was treated like a terrorist after she participated in the Convoy to Ottawa protest. You can see our coverage of that peaceful anti-mandate demonstration, which lasted about 4 weeks in Ottawa, our nation's capital, at convoyreports.com. Sarah also notes Trudeau's invocation of the terrorism law, the Emergencies Act, on peaceful convoy protesters. I'll read directly from her complaint here. By way of invoking the Emergencies Act, the government prohibited participation in public assemblies contrary to Article 20 of the UN Declaration on Human Rights. The government prohibited travel to and within the locations where the freedom convoys were amassed, contrary to Articles 19 and 20 of the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, and prohibited financial support of the freedom convoys, and empowered the government and financial institutions to seize property and freeze assets of persons participating in the freedom convoys, contrary to Articles 19 and 20 of the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights. Now, Sarah lays out in her complaint that when other countries commit these sorts of fundamental human rights violations, like when Saudi Arabia or China does these sorts of things, the UN takes notice. Again, what else can we do when the prosecutions won't stop and the systems before us are failing and the protections we are afforded under Canadian law, like our rights to free expression, association, and religion, are being completely ignored and ultimately criminalized? We have to do something. When history looks back at us, at all of you with 2020 hindsight, and asks us what we did to fight back and to defend the rights of Canadians, the rights of people we've never even met because it was the right thing to do, we can answer together and say that we did everything we could. If you'd like to help us, if you'd like to get involved in this fight for human rights here in Canada, please consider donating to offset our costs, our last-minute flights, and the cost of having one of the best and most effective lawyers in the entire country draft the best possible complaint that she could. Consider donating at humanrightscomplaint.com. Thank you in advance to everybody who makes this important work possible. We couldn't do any of it without you. For Rebel News, I'm Sheila Gunn Reid. Rebel News is taking our fight for human rights all the way to the United Nations in Geneva, Switzerland. Myself and lawyer Sarah Miller, based out of Calgary, are hand-delivering a complaint detailing the civil rights violations happening to Canadians, all in the name of public health. To offset our travel and our legal costs, please consider making a donation at humanrightscomplaint.com.